sneak preview event as Geeta Kapur presents her new book, To Drink from the Well, The Struggle for Racial Equality at the Nation's Oldest Public University. This timely and important new book chronicles the racism within the University of North Carolina and traces its effects on students, faculty, its sports program, and more. She's joined here tonight by UNC Associate Professor of History, Dr. William Sturkey. The book actually publishes in a few weeks, so we are very thankful that Blair Publishers has allowed us to hold this event early and to sell these books to you tonight. They understand that this is a topic of great interest and concern for our community. I'm Maggie Rowe, the Marketing and Events Manager here at Flyleaf. Thank you to our audience for coming tonight and for purchasing a copy of Geeta's book from us. We so appreciate your financial support as we continue to navigate our small local business through this pandemic, and we can't bring programs like this to you without your help. I'd like to thank our co-partners, UNC's Carolina Public Humanities Department, who are live streaming this event over Zoom for the folks watching at home. Geeta has already signed and personalized your books before the talk. We do close to the public at 7 p.m. tonight, so we're asking the authors to conclude around 7 so we can be mindful of our colleagues who are closing up the store after the event. If you'd like to linger and chat afterwards, I encourage you to go outside the store where we had the signing line. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our authors before turning the event over to them. Geeta Kapur is a seasoned civil rights and criminal defense lawyer who has devoted her career to defending poor and oppressed racial minorities. Kapur was the lead pro bono lawyer for the North Carolina's NAACP Moral Monday protests, led by Reverend William Barber, and received the prestigious North Carolina NAACP's Humanitarian of the Year Award for her service. She has argued landmark constitutional cases before the North Carolina Supreme Court and Court of Appeals. In 2012, Kapur's written testimony to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights hearing on the school-to-prison pipeline, and in 2015 presented at a U.S. Congress briefing on mass incarceration. She's been recognized by the National Trial Lawyers Association as one of the top 100 criminal defense lawyers in North Carolina. Kapur has appeared on National Public Radio, Radio 1, and local television and radio stations. She trained lawyers to respond to the mass protests in Charlotte, North Carolina over the police murder of Keith Scott. Kapur has taught an innovative pilot course on race and law at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Campbell Law School in Raleigh. Kapur graduated from both the UNC at Chapel Hill's undergraduate business and graduate law schools. She is a native of Kenya and currently lives in Durham, North Carolina. William Sturkey is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he teaches courses on modern United States history. He is also the author of the award-winning book, Hattiesburg, An American City in Black and White.
All right, thank you all so much for being here today. It's really an honor to be here today to talk about this book, which I think is it's fair to say this is the first comprehensive history of race at UNC Chapel Hill to ever be published, which is kind of amazing to think about with how long the institution has been dealing with race, how long the institution has been open. And I just can't help but think back to August of 2017, being up here today, when we had a huge panel at the library a week after Charlottesville, and of course Silent Sam was squared up for a couple of years in that moment. And it seemed like our community was so hungry to learn more about UNC and the history of race. And I think this book is so timely because these are obviously discussions, especially in the wake of last summer with George Floyd, that we're still having. And we've never had a book like this before. So thank you so much for writing this beautiful book, and I'm excited to talk more about it. But the one thing that I'll share with the audience, folks that haven't read it, is that your interest has much deeper roots. So like a lot of us in the community were interested in history, sure, but really awakened in 2017, 2018. But you've been thinking about this book for much longer. So could you tell us about sort of the origin stories of this book and why you felt so moved to take on such a big project?
Sure. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to the Flyleaf Bookstore for hosting us. And thank you, Dr. Sturkey, for being here. It's such an honor to share a stage with you. You are a superstar. And I also should acknowledge one other person. Lynn York from Blair Publisher is at the back there hiding. They've been an extraordinary team to work with. I've given them a hard time, and they made it. So thank you, Lynn, for everything. In 2010, I was at the Wilson Library on UNC's campus, and I saw this flyer. It was an exhibit on African Americans in the South from the 18th century to the present. So it immediately sparked my interest. So I went to the exhibit, and I immediately went to the educational section, where I saw these two black and white photographs. This is a picture of the first two African American students at UNC Law School. The caption beneath the photograph read that after a lengthy court battle, Harvey Beach, Kenneth Lee, and two other African American students were admitted to the University of North Carolina's law school in 1951. Well, the words lengthy court battle really struck me. Then there was this second black and white photograph of three African American men seated at the old well. The caption was similar. Ralph Frazier, Leroy Frazier, and John Brennan were the first undergraduate students at UNC, and they filed a lawsuit and won on appeal and were admitted in the fall of 1955. Well, in my mind, I started to think back to my constitutional law class. 1955 was after Brown versus Board of Education. And then I was stunned and shocked and felt very betrayed. I had attended UNC for my undergraduate studies and for law school, and had not ever seen these photographs, had never heard of these men, and didn't know this history. So I went searching for the court cases first, and then I went searching for their stories. And that led me to a much bigger search than I thought I was going to do, and it led me all the way back to the university's roots. And in the end, what I found, and the reason I wrote this book, is I found a much larger story about how the university is entangled with the Black community in Durham, with the first publicly historical Black college, North Carolina Central University, with the governor, other state officials, the legislature, the business community, and the NAACP's long war in Brown versus Board of Education. And it seemed the more I talked to people, because I thought maybe I'm the outlier, the more I talked to people, and I talked to some academic people, they all said, I didn't know this part, I didn't know that part. Everyday people certainly didn't know any of it. So it was my calling, and I wrote the book after I did all the research.
So UNC talks about its history all the time. Everyone that's ever heard anything about UNC knows that it's the first public university in the country. That much it's crammed down your throat ad nauseum. If you look at the visitor's book, every other page that's mentioned. Then there's all these other stories, right, about Davy Poplar, about the first student, Hitton James, who walked from Wilmington, right? And it's a very old university. But when it tells its story, the Black people that you point out, they don't appear until the 1950s, right? 160 years after the founding of the university. So I have two questions for you. First is, why is that? Why does the university struggle to tell its own story before integration? Because Black people were there, certainly. They were very much involved.
From the beginning.
Right. So why is it that the university struggles so much to tell its own story as it relates to race? And then what is that story? How does slavery fit into the university? And let's get into it. Okay.
Well, this morning I read an article by Clint Smith in The Atlantic, and he said, for some Americans, history is not the story of what actually happened. It's the story they want to believe. Right. And he basically summed up my book in one sentence. The university's past is one that is shameful and not a cause for pride at all. It's one of human bondage, one of racism, one of white supremacy, racial inequality and the oppression of black people, not just on campus, and not just in Chapel Hill, and not just in Orange County, but across this entire state. The university promoted and participated in slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and committed a number of other horrific injustices against black people. And again, that's throughout the state of North Carolina. This dark history contradicts the university's guiding principles of light and liberty. We hear that story a lot too, that, you know, our governing principles are light and liberty. So the story that's been passed down are the stories that Dr. Sturkey pointed out, the ones that romanticize how the university property was selected. The history is not the story of what actually happened. It's a narrative that the university wants people and the nation to believe. Hence, all the beautiful photographs of the old well with all the azaleas in full bloom. How many of us have not seen those pictures? It's an iconic symbol around the world now because the Moderna vaccine was invented here at UNC. So they've painted it to look like a magical place where everybody lives happily ever after. And the fact is that that's not true. They foster a culture of denial and of concealment. But, you know, as Dr. King told us, no lie can live forever, and truth crushed to the ground will rise again. And that's what my book is about. To answer the second part of your question, the university is inextricably bound with the institution of slavery. If we look at the very beginning of the university, 30 out of 40 of the first trustees of the university were slaveholders. Now, the trustees were all white men, all of the aristocratic class, very rich white men, very powerful white men who occupied positions like justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, governors of North Carolina. In those days, very few people owned more than, I believe it's either 16 or 20 slaves. Several of the trustees were the largest slaveholders in the state. One of the trustees, James Hogg, convinced his friend to donate 840 acres to the university. I think it's safe to presume that the white man who donated the land was a slaveholder. So in effect, he earned his wealth from slavery, and so that land was bought with blood money. Not to mention the fact that Native Americans were the original owners of that land. In fact, the enslaved people, when they were building bricks for Old East Dormitory, which is the first public state university building in the nation, when they were digging for limestone, they found a Native American burial ground. So you've got the trustees, the land, and then in the summer of 1793, enslaved men labored in the oppressive sun to clear trees for a main street that would be called Franklin Street after Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin Street itself is a monument to slavery. Enslaved men also built the old well, they built the Old East Dormitory, as I mentioned, and they built the first 8 buildings on campus, as well as the stone walls that surround campus. They made the bricks on the site, and I don't want to ruin the story in my book, but they literally built this university brick by brick. And the first 8 buildings are a monument to them, really. I mentioned that the trustees were slaveholders. The university's first president, Reverend Caldwell, was a slaveholder. Most of the professors were slaveholders. It was common for the university to rent enslaved people from the president, from professors, and from nearby plantations. Now, renting a slave is interesting because, the university would probably defend itself and say, well, we didn't really own slaves. We just rented them. But there was a case in the 1800s, State v. Mann. The opinion was authored by Chief Justice Thomas Ruffin, who was a university trustee and a slaveholder himself, and this is the essence of the case. The hiring master must have absolute power for the perfect submission of the hired slave. So there's no difference between renting a slave and owning a slave. I was really struck by some of the tasks that the slaves did. I couldn't find very much about who they were, what their names were. I, wondered what deferred dreams they had serving in bondage. But what I did find is that they shined shoes, they made beds, they had the dehumanizing task of emptying slop buckets, which were the toilets back then. They were filled with feces and urine. They brought water from the old well to the dormitories every single morning because back then the university didn't have running water. And they maintained the university's buildings. There's also another way that the university is directly tied to slavery. In the law, there's a doctrine called the escheat doctrine. When someone dies without a will and dies without legal heirs, their property passes to the state to be disposed of by the legislature. Well, the legislature, by statute, dictated that any escheated property would go directly to the university. Well, during slavery, that included enslaved people. In fact, the university was so committed to this that the university trustees, as well as lawyers in every area of the state, were empowered to go and look at court records to determine, if someone dies without a will or legal heirs, the estate has to go through probate, which means you have to go and file something with the court. So the trustees and the lawyers would go to the court, find the court records, and in one example, and there are many things that I learned in doing this research that I will never forget because it was very traumatizing to write this book. An elderly black man who was free gathered up all the money that he could to buy his daughter out of slavery. His daughter later had a son. He died without a will. Now, when he bought his daughter, he could not manumit her. He couldn't make her free because in the wake of Nat Turner's rebellion, the legislature made it illegal to free any slave. So the daughter is his property, and the grandson was his property as well. Well, he died without a will, like I said, and the property went to the university. The trustees were so heartless, they called the woman a useless wench. They sold the woman and the child. I'm not sure if they sold them to the same owner. I'm not sure if the woman and the child were separated. But they sold them quickly for cash. and the money went into the university's account. And this is not an isolated incident. The university did this over and over and over again, to the point that in 1 year, 69% of the university's revenue came from escheated property and enslaved people. The total, based upon my research, in today's value would be $9.4 million. So the university's connection to slavery is very deep.
One of the things that I found really powerful in the book, there's this appendix on page 29 to 30 where you reclaim some of the names that we don't share in public as part of our university story. And we see some of the enslaved people's names here, and it says there's a record of what they were paid to do. For example, a man named Evans, plasterer and mason, repairs on South Building in 1837. There's a man named Harry, building Gerard Hall in 1826. I'm wondering about that decision and what that means to you to print their names here and to actually, to essentially rescue them from historical erasure in some way. But, what does it mean to actually give these people names and sort of give them their due in a book like this?
Well, I had an academic at UNC who will remain unnamed, it was not Dr. Sturkey, who said to me after he read my line that their names, actually, if you give me 1 second, I'll be able to find it so I can read it. So, yet their names, their native languages, their cultural traditions, their dreams, their hopes, their feelings, and their history will forever remain unknown. On this bedrock of white supremacy, racial injustice, and iniquity stands the University of North Carolina. I'm reading off of page 18 in the second paragraph. So, at first, you would think that that's contradicted by this chart with these names. And when I found this chart, I was heartbroken by the work that they did. But I was more heartbroken by the names. Because these were not the real names of these people. These were their given slave names, right? And naming is very powerful, was a very powerful part of slavery, of owning somebody and erasing their entire connection to Africa. And because of the time periods in which some of these people labored, they must have still carried their African names. And so we may know that Abraham did repairs to South Building in 1837, but we'll never know who Abraham really was. So finding this was problematic to me, but I thought it needed to be in here because this is also a part of how the university erased these people from history.
Pretty early on in the book, in the second chapter, you take us to Durham and talk about some of Durham's early black founders. So what's the connection, broadly speaking, between Durham and that black community that emerged in Durham and UNC Chapel Hill?
There was an independent black community in Durham. In fact, at one point, Durham was known as the Black Wall Street of America, in large part because of an institution there called the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, which was the largest black-owned business in the world. So they, because of their financial position, they were able to start a bank, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank in Durham, and that bank financed a number of businesses in the black community. So they essentially were not dependent upon the white community for really much at all. So in 1933, a lawsuit was filed against the university for Thomas Hocutt to be admitted to the School of Pharmacy. Thomas Hocutt is from that community. 1951, another lawsuit was filed by Kenneth Lee, Harvey Beach, those African American men in that photograph. They were all from that community. And then the final lawsuit in well, I shouldn't say final because the university is always being sued. In 1955, the lawsuit for the three high school students to enter the undergraduate college, they were also from Durham's Hayti community. So in my research, it was very clear to me that there was a connection between the university and this community, because every battle to gain what the black citizens of North Carolina should have had came from this community. The lawyers were from this community, with the exception of Thurgood Marshall and some other lawyers from the NAACP. So that's really the connection.
What was the most shocking discovery in your research?
Like I said, there are many, many shocking discoveries. The two that stand out to me now is that, I mentioned in 1933, the university was sued by Thomas Hocutt to enter the School of Pharmacy. Thurgood Marshall later said that was the case that paved the way for Brown versus Board of Education. That was actually the first case filed to desegregate an institution of higher education right here at UNC. And the undergraduate college lawsuit case that was filed in 1955, that was after Brown. And it's interesting, I'm sorry, I'm going to ruin part of the story for some of you, but the university took the position after Brown that Brown did not apply to institutions of higher learning. It only applied to the lower public and secondary institutions. That's just mind-blowing. So the lawsuit is filed, and the university fought the case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. In their brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, they said that Brown was wrongly decided, and they were giving the court an opportunity to issue the right ruling. Now, as a lawyer, I was absolutely floored and stunned. There were no cases, used to support that legal premise, and quite frankly, they were being extraordinarily disrespectful to the justices. The second shocking discovery is on page 102 of my book. The university in the 1920s owned and operated the water, the electric, and the telephone systems in Chapel Hill. The town owned the sewer systems. What's interesting is that the university piped water from its intake area through the black community, and then the water came to UNC where it was treated, and then it was pumped back out, only to the white communities. So the African American community in Chapel Hill had polluted wells. And in one oral history, it didn't make it into my book, but in one oral history, a man talks about how children would jump in those polluted wells and die. I don't think I'll ever get over that. I cannot wrap my mind around that. They pumped the water through the black community, cleaned it, and then pumped it out only to white people. It's basically what we would call environmental racism today.
I'm kind of wondering, so I'm going to ask just 2 more questions and then just open it up to everybody. I'm kind of wondering about name changes and what your take is on name changes and why people resist them so much. So, you know, the first big one that we had was Saunders Hall in 2015, after which the university imposed a moratorium against changing any other building names. That was lifted last year in the wake of George Floyd. They removed the names of people involved in the 1898 Wilmington Massacre. There are other names being considered right now. I think next week there's going to be another vote. But I was interested in why you think it's so hard to have these conversations and why people are so resistant. I went back to the Alumni Magazine article today, and I looked at some of the comments that people had left, some of the alumni. And I just want to share some of those. And I mean, some of them are just quite stunning, but I'm going to quote people directly. This is after they changed the name of Saunders Hall, who was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina. This was the last straw for me. I am no longer proud to be associated with UNC. We cannot rewrite history, only learn from it. Another alumni said, seems like an attempt to rewrite history, the kind of thing Adolf Hitler would have done. Another alumni said, as one who earned an undergraduate and a graduate degree primarily in Saunders Hall, I believe it is a terrible shame to rename Saunders Hall. I attended the university in the late 1950s, a time when we correctly welcomed all people to UNC regardless of color, creed, or national origin, and it was the right thing to do. So, obviously, that was submitted by a white alumni. But what is your reaction to, you know, this whole process and how difficult it is, and how tightly so many people, whether they are alumni or they're on the board of trustees or, you know, whoever they might be, how tightly people hold on to some of these names and why there's such opposition to it?
I think it goes back to, you know, what I said in the beginning, that history is not about what actually happened. History is about what we want to believe. And this campus, as the nation's oldest public university, has many buildings named after avowed white supremacists, slaveholders. I think the resistance is similar now to why people won't take the COVID shot, right? And there's a resistance to believing that racism still exists. You know, we shouldn't have had to have gotten to a moment in the society where we had to see, all of us had to see a white police officer with his knee on a black man's throat who was suffocating and saying, I want my mama, I cannot breathe. We should not have had to get to that moment to deal with race. We haven't really dealt with race. They claim we've had a racial reckoning, we haven't. The fact of the matter is that in critical race theory, there's this principle called interest convergence. Interest convergence means that the needs of black people are only met when they coincide with the interests of white people. So take, for example, Brown versus Board of Education. Black people are fighting to enter white public schools, or fighting for them to be equalized and fighting to be admitted into institutions of higher learning. Well, if you look back to what was going on behind the curtain in the Supreme Court, that was during the Cold War period. And the United States was being criticized abroad for having segregation at home. So the interests of white people align with the needs of black people, and then there's a change. Or there's an emergency like George Floyd. But the change does not live longer than the emergency. So when the emergency has faded away, you'll notice that now they're not just Black Lives Matter signs. They're signs with, 8 messages. The most potent message that this nation needs to hear, which is Black Lives Matter, has been diluted. So I think that the resistance to changing the building names has to do with the fact that many of the powerful alumni of this institution are conservative. They don't want the names changed. But again, it goes all to this point that the university has created this myth about what they want people to believe. I was here as an undergrad. I took classes in Saunders Hall. I didn't know who he was. I used to go to the student stores. I didn't know it was named after someone that was instrumental in the Wilmington riot, instrumental in the red shirt, white supremacy movement in North Carolina.
Let me ask just one more question, then we'll open it up. So obviously this is very political. And there's a lot of people on one side of the aisle that say, it's these liberals at the university, even Marxists at times, who just are too politically correct and they want to erase history. We've heard this line of argument. But then from the people at the university now, we often say, well, our hands are tied. There's nothing that we can do because the conservatives are running the state legislature. They're on the board of governors. Woe is us. It's really hard. But at the same time, I can't help but observe, but there was a long time in North Carolina where the Democratic Party did control the board of governors, did control the board of trustees, and did essentially control the university. And we certainly did not have a racial reckoning during that period of time. And so I wonder if we could maybe set aside the partisan aspect of it and really think, what is it, entirely that prevents this or has prevented this from happening up to this point in time?
Well, I think it's class. If we look at the first board of trustees, they were of the upper wealthy class, and it's been that way until now. They don't have a community member on the board of trustees. Someone from the African American community where those polluted wells were. So the university has always been controlled by rich white men. And, at the end of the day, rich white Democrats have interests that are aligned with rich Republicans, whether they're rich or not. They just align themselves with the Republican Party, right? So it's really about class.
Well, let's go ahead and take some questions from folks here, and if we get any questions from the people streaming online.
Actually, I have two questions. One is curiosity about the 1930s, the suit you talked about when the first one was trying to get in. How was that decided, and what was the rationale behind it? And two, if you did your study on most any university, University of Massachusetts or Harvard or wherever, would you find similar things? How unique is what you think you found here to either Southern universities or to this university in particular? Or you take either one first.
Well, I'd be hesitant to talk about other universities because I haven't actually looked into their research. But Georgetown, for example, recently acknowledged that slaves were instrumental in their founding, in the building of the campus, and have made an effort with what they call reparations to the enslaved community that was eventually displaced to Louisiana. So I'm hesitant to talk about other communities, but I would venture to say that in the South, this is probably a common story. To your first question about the case that was filed in 1933, the outcome of that case was it's technical legally, so I don't want to bore you all, but basically the judge said, and he said it correctly, that they hadn't filed the proper legal filing. So they had filed for the university to admit him, and the court could not sit as an admissions board. What they needed to do was file it in federal court and ask for the judges to order the university to process the applications without regard to race.
And that was never done.
Not in the 1933 case, no. Because again, that was the first case.
I'm going to jump in and ask another question then.
Okay.
So I want you to talk about Nikole Hannah-Jones and where this fits in. Obviously, she's very well known in many circles for what she's done in terms of studying history. We had a big, obviously everyone heard of this, right? We had a big kerfuffle, let's call it, because we're streaming. But I mean, where does that? I know this is wide open, but where does that all fit into this?
Well, one of the opening quotes to my book is this. It's from Lewis Austin, who was the editor of the Carolina Times in Durham, which was a black newspaper, which he owned, and he wrote, "History will reveal that at no time has the oppressors of a people ever voluntarily lifted their heels from the necks of the oppressed, and that it has only been through push, struggle, or force that oppressed people have been able to move toward the goal of free men." We saw this playing out in the Nikole Hannah-Jones tragedy. The university only made the moral decision after it was pushed and forced, after struggle. They had to be threatened with a lawsuit, and then there were protests that were mounted, which protests are a form of struggle. This is the pattern that has occurred throughout the university's history. For example, in 1983, the university trustees recognized that there was a need for a Black cultural center. They conducted a feasibility study. The study said that the center would have to have at least 23,000 feet. Well, that was too much for the trustees, so the idea languished for a while. 5 years later, after some protest, the university shoved the Black Cultural Center into 900 square feet in the student union. That's where the Black Cultural Center was when I was a student. So from 23,000 square feet to 900 square feet. And the Black Cultural Center came about in the student union largely because of the efforts of Dr. Sonia Haynes Stone. Dr. Stone had fought the university to grant her tenure. And in the process, she suffered an aneurysm and died. Her death in 1991 became a catalyst for students. She was a beloved professor. If she found a student who didn't have clothes, she would buy him clothes. If she found a student who didn't have food, she would take them home. She was just beloved by white and Black students. Well, so what's key about these protests is there were 4 football players who were leaders of the protests, and the football players threatened to not play football unless a freestanding Sonia Haynes Stone Center, African American Cultural Center, was built on campus. Well, football players threatening not to play football at a southern school at the University of North Carolina made national headlines. It caught the attention of Spike Lee. It also caught the attention of Reverend Jesse Jackson. In one protest, students sat down in Chancellor Paul Hardin's office and refused to leave. They were arrested. Sounds very familiar to Moral Mondays. Well, after they were arrested, Reverend Jackson and Spike Lee came to Chapel Hill because there was a massive rally in the Dean Dome. It would take the trustees 8 more years well, I'm sorry, let me go back. So in 1991, there was that massive protest. And then in 1993, the Board of Trustees said, okay, fine, again, probably because of the threat of the football players not playing football, they said, okay, fine, you can have a Black Cultural Center, but you all go raise all the money. It took 8 years for supporters to raise all the money that they needed. And in 2004, 21 years after the struggle had begun, the Sonia Haynes Stone Center opened. So there we see the university being pushed, forced after struggle, after protest, to make the moral decision. And if we look in more recent times, we saw this being played out with Silent Sam. Students had been protesting since the 1960s about Silent Sam. The University Board of Governors made a backdoor deal with the Sons of the Confederacy for $2.5 million to care for Silent Sam. Right? And I take you back to the Black Cultural Center. You raised your own money. Well, the problem with the deal is that it made national news. And so condemnation came down on the university. And prominent alumni mounted a struggle, got together somehow and wrote, well, they all signed on to a brief written by their lawyer asking the judge to reopen the case because a judge approved the case, approved the settlement, to reopen the case because it damaged the university's liberal reputation and really underscored its commitment to white supremacy. It's only after push, struggle, force that the deal was voided and the university had to take back the money, but they paid their lawyers $80,000. So Nicole Hannah-Jones is not granted tenure. There's a protest that's mounted by students and alumni. They're threatened with a lawsuit, and then they reluctantly give her tenure.
It actually wasn't that she wasn't granted tenure, it wasn't voted on. So they withheld, so the package never made it to the Board of Trustees to vote on.
Well, that's what they said, and that's a story they want you to believe. The truth of the matter is that she was promised tenure. She was promised tenure, and one of the trustees went to the provost and said, we do not want this coming before the Board of Trustees.
Yeah, at some point it didn't make it to the whole board.
Right, but a trustee going to a provost is in effect another backdoor way to make sure that this woman doesn't get tenure, right? So we can say the Board of Trustees never voted on it. That's accurate, but let's look behind the curtain and actually see what transpired.
I'm so interested in that part, why it never made it to the Board of Trustees. To me, that's what I think is so interesting about the press never pushed that point to say, why did it not get any further? It just...
You may have some insights on that because you were very vocal.
Well, I'm not sure if I was that vocal, but I was paying attention. But North Carolina Policy Watch, to me, there is this missing piece. But North Carolina Policy Watch reported that an anonymous member of the Board of Trustees, it's not a very big group, it's probably 1 or 4 people, but an anonymous member came to them and told them that there had been calls from Raleigh, from state legislators, who don't put things in email, they don't put things in writing, but they call people, and they lean on them in that way. So, and this person was quoted as saying it was definitely political, it definitely came from the right, and so there was this pressure that came in that ultimately we'll never know about, even though they're supposed to be public servants. And I think that's how that came to be. Question here?
I have a question I'm trying to get wrap in my head, so I'm going to go to something else first while I figure this out. But with the Black Cultural Center with the 900 square feet, if I'm not mistaken, I was gone by then. that really was a priority. If I'm not mistaken, wasn't that like more of a priority use, that black students and black groups could get it first if they put in the request, whereas in the 70s on South Campus was Upendo Lounge.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm gonna say this bluntly, it was ours. We just used it. But if I'm not mistaken, when the 900 feet was set aside, I think it was final. You had the first right to reserve it. It still wasn't a dedicated space, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, Chancellor Paul Hardin during the struggle said that we can't have a center for every group. We don't have a center for white students, and that was part of what he said.
So, my other question is, I'm going on the premise that a lot of this is out of fear. A lot of the resistance that you were asking about is out of fear, probably even an unrecognized fear among white leaders. Do you have any evidence or any ideas of what that real core fear is?
Well,
If you accept the premise of fear.
I'm not so sure it's fear as much as it is racism. And I was watching a documentary one time about the trials of Daryl Hunt. If you all haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. And one of his supporters said that racism is irrational. You can't argue with something that's irrational. You can't use logic to defy something that's irrational, right? So I think at the core of it all, it's racism and a desire to maintain white supremacy.
But I guess that's why I'm talking about this fear, the fear that they're going to lose their place. That's the fear I think that I'm probably trying to get my head wrapped around.
We have a question from somebody who's streaming this. Are there any attorneys or activists working for reparations for ancestors whose descendants worked at UNC?
I don't think there are any attorneys that are working on that. Dr. Sandy Darity from Duke University recently wrote a book on reparations. That's really the only thing I can think of. But I don't know of any attorneys or activists that are working on it. But that person should start a movement.
Well, the case with Georgetown that was mentioned earlier, the people owned by the university were sold to basically two different entities. So it was a lot easier to trace them as opposed to like these individuals that were sort of sold by UNC, as they came up over decades and decades. So I think it would be incredibly difficult to do that. Not that you couldn't do it, but.
Well, there's still a very prominent presence of the Caldwell community.
Right.
And in my book, I talk about Wilson Caldwell.
Could you say a few words about Wilson Caldwell real quick? I know there's a lot to cover, but.
Well, when I was doing my research, I was stunned by all of the resistance I saw. I remember being at the State Archives in Raleigh going through Governor Luther Hodges' papers. He was the governor when Brown was decided. And I was just baffled, and I naively wondered, when did this all start? So I came back to the Wilson Library. I opened the glass doors to go into the room to start doing research, and there was a photograph, a very grainy photograph of an African-American man perched on a canvas. I looked at it, and the entire world around me stopped. I could not take my eyes off of him. And I later learned from the caption that he was a slave owned by President Swain, who was the president of the university. And the librarians told me that he was buried in the African American section of the university cemetery. So I had already decided that he was the beginning. The answer to my question was he was the beginning, and I felt like in that moment where I was looking at him, I felt like he was saying to me, tell my story, I'm the beginning. So I went to his grave, and I was shocked by the tribute to him on his grave. The last 2 sentences of it were, let him rest here until he's ready for work again. That literally brought me to tears because, again, I wondered about what dreams he had. He had a large family, many children. What dreams did he have for his children? Even in death, even after death, he's still enslaved. So, and again, I didn't know very much about him. We hear a lot about George Moses Horton, who was a slave who published a book. Didn't hear much about Wilson Caldwell. So I made him a promise before I left that day that I would tell his story. And he's the opening story in my book.
I was listening to a podcast earlier this summer, and the author T.S.E. Lehman was saying that oftentimes Black intellectuals have felt a pressure to say, I criticize this country because I love it so much. And he was saying, why do I have to establish that I love this country in order to criticize it? And I guess I'm wondering, in terms of your own attitudes towards and relationship with UNC, how would you characterize your feelings towards the institution?
Well, my feelings have wavered and evolved over time. Initially, I was very angry. Like I said, I felt very betrayed. The more I learned about the university's history with race, the angrier I became. But I just used that as motivation to write. But, you know, now I'm at a place where I would tell African American students that this university is more theirs than it is of the white students. You know, if you go to Old East Dormitory, you'll see there's a 2-foot foundation of bricks. Every one of those bricks was built by an enslaved person. This entire campus, though some of the buildings are named after white supremacists, some of the buildings, well, really all of the buildings were built by enslaved people, maintained during Jim Crow by black workers, and today housekeepers are still predominantly black people, right? This is our campus. You know, in fact, I found myself recently buying a ton of Carolina blue things, Carolina blue earrings, Carolina blue shirt. I decided I'm going to wear Carolina blue. This is our university, and for Native American people, it's their university too. This is their land. So I think Dr. Darity said that he has a love-hate relationship with the university. His father was the first to earn a PhD in 1964. I think that would characterize my relationship with the university, love, hate, but I own it now more than ever.
I think we have to go ahead and close out because they're going to ask us to leave the building, literally. But I just want to encourage you all to buy the book, read the book. It's really incredible. It's the first to accomplish this, I think, to tell this story. And I just want to leave any last words that you might want to share with all of us about what do you think a better way forward is, or any final takeaway message?
To be honest, I haven't really had time to wrestle with that. And you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones in her statement said that the burden should not be upon people of color to come up with a solution. And I think that's true here. We shouldn't have to use our intellectual power to come up with solutions. We should be at the table when the decisions are being made. I haven't really wrestled with that.
Well, please, all of you, join me in thanking Geeta for the book and for the event.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for coming here tonight. Please keep an eye out for upcoming events in both our newsletter and our website. We've got some great programs planned for you guys this fall. Oh, and you can book a seat ahead of time. Thank you so much again for coming tonight, and thank you to you both, Geeta and Sturkey. Good night. Ugh.